Hello and welcome to ThePrint Softcover, which is our online platform where we launch non-fiction books. And today we'll be discussing India's Near East, a new history by author Avinash Paliwal, who has been kind enough to join us today. He is a reader in international relations at SOAS University of London. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me here, Pia.
Now, this is a very interesting, intriguing book that sort of weaves together the histories of India's neighborhood, specifically the Northeast, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Bhutan, and also China's role in the region. And this book covers, narco crime, insurgencies, regional complexities, and it's based on extensive archival research, including countless interviews with intelligence officials, diplomats, senior politicians, and so on. And my first question would be, what prompted you to write this book?
Pia, thank you for such a kind introduction. This book, the research for this book began in end of 2016, early 2017, after I had completed my first book, which was invested in India's approach towards Afghanistan. Having done India's Western neighbors, I felt there was a need perhaps to kind of look at India's other regions and to really ask the question, how has this country gone about building a nation and projecting power in an area where it does enjoy considerable equities, both diplomatically, militarily, economically, politically, socially. And that's where the nucleus of this idea of looking at India's East really came into being. The first step was to really kind of understand India's approach towards Myanmar. But the more I entered Myanmar and try to understand that relationship, I felt that the story cannot be told by just looking at Myanmar. It had to be bigger. It had to be a bottoms-up view, and it needed to include not only all of India's far eastern states, also known as the northeast of India, but also Bangladesh. And this is where it all began. And it very quickly became a very frustrating exercise, to be very honest with you, because there's a lot of literature. There's a lot of very valuable literature if you look at Bangladesh, if you look at Myanmar, and also if you look at the northeast of India and its relationship with the Union and its own kind of dynamics internally, right? But none of these literatures were actually speaking to each other. So when I was studying Myanmar, I'd be dealing with colleagues who had very little understanding of either Bangladesh or northeast of India, or definitely not of how New Delhi works. And that was a similar case I felt was to be seen when I was engaging with literatures and colleagues who were working on Bangladesh and northeast of India. So that's where sometime in 2017-18, I decided that, look, if I am to do justice to this project, I have to look at the entirety of India's Near East. That's what prompted me to look at Near East. That's also what prompted me to coin the term Near East without its shorn of its colonial connotations, just as an analytical category.
And I must say also, this is an important book for journalists as well, such as me, who cover the Ministry of External Affairs and have also been witnessing the dramatic turn of events in our neighboring country, Bangladesh. Myanmar, we know, faced a coup in February 2021. And so that's why I think, as you've mentioned, in the range of literature that we have on India's Act East policy, this plugs a gap in that. Might I say, you did mention in your book that India's sort of strategic import, rather, of its eastward policy has been suboptimal. That's the adjective you used. What can we do? What can the Indian government do to make this optimal?
Thank you. Look, let me first unpack the point of suboptimality, right, before I perhaps go into policy recommendations, which is always kind of, it's risky business because there is no silver bullet to making these approaches optimal, so to say. See, my point of suboptimality comes from a fact that this is a region which has been partitioned, Pia, right? Partitioned, and the logic of partition is grounded in very deep-rooted social causes, whether it's communal differences, whether it's class differences, whether it's caste, whether it's gender, whether it's race. In Myanmar, there was a very powerful racial element to the politics when it came to Indians, right? People of Burmese of Indian heritage, especially in the early decades after independence. So how do you go about bringing strategic unity to a region which has been partitioned along very powerful social lines? And how do you do that while building a state, while building a nation, right? The post-colonial, the state of India, while asserting yourself over a demography which is quite, unhappy with that contract that you have to offer, even though constitutionally undergirded by the Constitution of India. But there has been considerable pushback, whether it was in the Naga areas, whether it was in the Mizo areas, in Assam later, Manipur, elsewhere, you know the story. And the fact that a region which was also administratively united, economically united during the colonial period, it was divided along communal lines even then quite actively by colonial officials, but administratively united. People could move without visas. It was, and then you have international boundaries which have come into being after 1947, and then of another quality after 1971. That is a very difficult task. And the government of India and various kind of interlocutors, both inside the government and outside the government, have tried to, if not undo the partition in that sense, but overcome the challenges that comes with those partitions by arguing for a united whether it was Look East policy, Act East policy, building bridges, literally building bridges, building railway lines, having more trade, having more people-to-people connections. And throughout history, we see that however strong the policy urge was to connect, the dynamics on the ground more often than not, militated against those policy urges, whether they were coming from Naypyidaw or Yangon, whether they were coming from Dhaka, whether they were coming from New Delhi. And I think that imparted a challenge which has just been very difficult to surmount for policymakers in Delhi. And that's where the suboptimality comes in. Now, this is a circumstantial explanation for suboptimality of India's approach towards its Near East. There were also, as I call in the book, official antinomies, right? You adopt a policy which has various contradictions built into it. You are building an electoral kind of presence, right? India is a democracy. You want to have elections in northeast of India, in West Bengal. But those electoral dynamics also fuel antagonisms for their own purposes, for its own logic, whether it's for the Congress party, whether it's for the BJP today, or any other regional party on the ground. And in that case, the electoral logic, which requires a degree of polarization, unfortunately, at times, right, or it's exercised in practice, again militates against this idea of unity, of strategic unity. And my last point to explain suboptimality is when you have hard borders the way we do in India's Near East, but I mean, all of India's borders at this point in time are hard borders, whether it's with China, it's militarized, with Pakistan, we know the situation. How do you have, if not free trade, freer trade, a more comfortable trade relationship with your neighbors, formalized trade? That just goes against the logic. And that is a contradiction in itself. My argument in the book is India is best connected with its neighbors in an economic sense in the illicit domain, unfortunately, not informal trade. There's the huge agony around, India should connect better to Southeast Asia as part of its Act East policy. And if you look at the facts on the ground, Pia, it is connected, but it's connected much more in the underground rather than it is on the overground. And that comes with its own logic, that comes with its own pressures, that has a segue into India's electoral politics in the Northeast and elsewhere. And that creates pressures which impart suboptimality to India's broader desire for strategic and political unity in its east. What may India do? Again, that's a very difficult question to answer. I do not have a silver bullet to this, but I think the one thing which I believe at the end of this project I felt is worth saying, rather than giving a policy recommendation which might not work, is to say that at least any policymaker or any political leader of India, or from the far eastern states of India and Manipur, Assam, should respect the constitution. And it's a very obvious thing to say. It's a very basic thing to say. But given, what is happening in Manipur today, given what the region has seen in the past, given how India's anxieties are heightened with regime change in Bangladesh and civil war in Myanmar, the best cordon sanitaire that can impart some degree of optimality, if not, or inch closer towards that direction, is to abide by the constitutional fabric of this country, especially in sensitive and diverse regions such as the northeast of India and India's eastern neighbors. Right? That's the drive. That's what drove India's approach towards this entire region and elsewhere in the 1950s, and that's what many policymakers, including in the Congress, realized during the 1990s. The ceasefire decade, as I call the early 2000s, where you fired Bodos, with the Nagas, with the NSC and IM, you're having ceasefires. That was a decade of a degree of humility, where there was an assessment that you cannot adopt an aggressive posture and expect enduring positive results and political solutions to deep-rooted social problems. That constitutional humility is perhaps the need of the hour, even today. Whether it will lead to utmost optimality, I'm not sure, but it would be much less suboptimal than perhaps what we have seen it to be till now.
All right, fair enough. Let me sort of rephrase it also, because you mentioned an interesting term, hard borders. Take Myanmar, for example, and we at The Print have reported on this extensively, that the border is sensitive. It's for many years has been porous. Manipur, Myanmar, you have tribes who go to school on the other side, they have cousins living on the other side, and now you have the Home Ministry intent on fencing that border. Those kind of policies, are they in the direction of humility and constitutionalism that you have just mentioned?
It's a very risky decision, Pia, as you have hinted at yourself, right? The desire to fence the India-Myanmar border is not new. This is a desire that comes up with the political cycles over decades. It has come up many times over the decades, and it has been shot down. Usually the desire comes from New Delhi, where there is a strong urge to assert control over India's kind of cross-border movements, to stem the movement of people, whether legal or illegal, to kind of at least control it, to stem the movement of goods and services, right, as you mentioned. And by the time that desire meets the ground reality, it often kind of gets diluted to a considerable extent. The only place in northeast of India, the entire region, where a degree of success has been achieved to fence, perhaps today, has been in certain parts of the Manipur-Myanmar border areas. And that too is how long that will last is an open question. Naga communities in Nagaland, in North Manipur, Mizo communities in Mizoram, and of course Zokuki communities in South Manipur. They're very clear that this is hard fencing of the border is not acceptable because it impacts their daily lives. Now, that is again a contradiction, right? That is again, how do you pitch connectivity and act east by putting those borders? So there is a contradiction, and I do fear that if this idea of fencing is pursued with commitment, could lead to second-order effects, which will not feed into resolving the situation in Manipur or elsewhere. It might aggravate the situation moving forward. And look, the Nagas have broadly been quiet around this whole issue, right? They've stayed away. Whether it's in North Manipur, Nagaland is a different story to an extent. But I fear any political resolution now to the kind of disputes that have emerged, the conflict between the wider Zokuki community and the Meiteis, lead to certain gives and certain compromises, whether it's by the central government or in a local regional setting, which might lead to second-order effects among the Naga communities as well, who might desire something more while negotiating forward movement on the Naga Accord. So it's a very, very, as you mentioned, it's a very sensitive situation. Any decision which is too hard and which does not appreciate the complexity or the flexibility, the malleability of people, goods, services of that region, and very strong identity and community feelings, is unlikely to lead to a lasting solution.
Well, I want to move a little bit also to Bangladesh, given the former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina is in Delhi right now and has been ever since the dramatic turn of events took place in Bangladesh. We saw it first as student protests, anti-government protests, and now a new interim government has been installed in Bangladesh. In the book, and of course in many range of literature about Bangladesh, the attacks on Hindus during the military coup after the assassination of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman has been detailed quite extensively, as you do as well in your book. And my question is, this time around, the head of the interim government, Mohammad Yunus, has called the attacks on Hindus exaggerated, while the Indian government has very much made this its main talking point when interacting and engaging with the Yunus government. In your view, do you see this as exaggerated this time around?
Thank you for that excellent question, Pia. Look, I'm of the view, first of all, Hindus in Bangladesh and in East Pakistan before have been targeted. That's just a fact.
Right.
At what scale, how many, which part can be debated, can be assessed, can be recorded, can be disputed. And I'm not in a position sitting in London to adjudicate the absolute accuracy of every claim being made by Indians or being disputed by the Bangladeshis at this point in time. But I do know one thing is that the situation of minority communities, not just Hindus in Bangladesh, but also Sikhs, Ahmadiyas, Christians, the fate of that community and their well-being is politically determined. It's not a social fact that every neighbor of the majority community will protect their minority community neighbor. And that's a subcontinental fact. This is not just true for Bangladesh, right? This is true for communal minority communities, religious minorities in India. This is true for religious minorities in Sri Lanka, definitely so in Pakistan, but elsewhere as well, right? So that is a fact that I would start my point from, that, whether or not mass killings have happened in Bangladesh, and I suspect, that the actual number might not be that high, but the effect and the anxiety it has created, both in India and within certain sections of the minority communities in Bangladesh, is not something that can be taken lightly or can be disrespected. There is fear. There is fear amongst Hindus, and I think they are also fearful because, the situation on the ground in a political sense is not settled yet. The interim government has a reform agenda. They are trying to make sure law and order is preserved. They are trying to make sure economy is reformed, or at least prevented from collapse, it is very close to collapse in some senses. So what contract will the Bangladeshi minority communities enjoy moving forward is an open question. And because it is an open question, there is a lot of politics around that. Bangladeshi leaders will say that they want to prevent, and all of them across, even the Jamaat-e-Islami has come out saying, we want to protect Hindus. And I do believe that they mean it seriously. Whether they're able to actually protect is a different matter. But I don't think the political intent, at least in the interim government among the coterie of Chief Advisor Mohammad Yunus, I don't think they are there's an ill will towards the community as such, right? But that also means, because it's a political question, that India's anxieties around that question remains. And whatever charge that comes can be seen as exaggerated by Bangladesh, both the government and the people. And it's in some ways it shows the kind of disconnect between India and Bangladesh. For all talks of connectivity, for all talks of being a very, the golden period, the Sonalia Adhyay during Hasina, these were two countries which were also deeply disconnected at a very basic level. No amount of visas to Bangladeshis to do tourism to India would be able to overcome that basic kind of cognitive disconnect that has emerged between the people of India and the people of Bangladesh. And that is just a very, very sad and unfortunate reality. Two countries, two neighbors talking completely at cross purposes with each other, trying to figure out how to work together, of course. And you can see New Delhi has accepted to work with the interim government. But it's just a very, very shocking situation, both for Bangladeshis with the fall of the government. It came, not many expected it to happen. Not Hasina herself did not expect that to happen. Definitely not the Indians. So you are in a very novel situation where you don't know where this will go. And as history is a guide, novel uncertainties just exacerbate your anxieties around these questions. And historically, too, look, you mentioned 1975. I would say even before 1960s, before there was a lot of systematic targeting, much more then perhaps than after 71 of the Hindus in Bangladesh. And that is a trauma which is deeply rooted in India's political and social memory. And this is why it's not just the BJP which is saying that Hindus have to be protected. Even the Congress accepts that. It's not just a concern being raised by the Hindu conservatives in India. This is, the entire political spectrum of India, whether rightly or wrongly, is of the opinion that this is a cause of concern. And I think that is something for policymakers in Dhaka to be very conscious of as well moving forward.
I'm going to now ask you a question that a lot of our MEA journalists have asked in our briefings every week since Sheikh Hasina fled to India. Does her stay hurt our Act East policy day by day?
In some senses, it complicates diplomacy between India and Bangladesh. It would be a thorny issue in the sense that, Dhaka has already expressed its desire for extradition to occur. Maybe they'll make a more formal pitch. I don't know if they already have. And that would not be an uncomfortable situation for India to deal with, even if it's unlikely to extradite Hasina, of course, right? So I think that would be a thorn, but I doubt that these are two countries, or these are two establishments in Dhaka and Delhi, which will let the question of Sheikh Hasina really derail the larger quality of this relationship or condemn it to persistent rivalry. I doubt that. I think both countries realize that whatever the acrimony may be at a popular level between the two countries, and whatever anxieties New Delhi may harbor against the government in Dhaka, or anxieties about who will come next when elections happen, whenever they do. The BNP will come to power, the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, or the Jamaat, maybe a combination of the two. It is in no one's interest to let this relationship go off the rails completely. And the sparks of that are also quite visible, right? You can see Indian diplomacy showing its kind of more sort of, proactive streak as well, that, silently, slowly just going and doing the outreach, talking to everyone on the ground, not letting the history come in the way of the new realities. And the Indian kind of external affairs minister has made it very clear that they're concerned, but they'll engage. So again, I do not see the question of Sheikh Hasina to be as potent. It's going to be an irritant, but I don't think that will kind of, and it kind of will have political lives depending on the electoral cycles. Some political party might make it an agenda issue during the electoral cycle, so it'll come up and then hopefully it'll go down. But I do not see that to be a strategic impediment. A bigger strategic impediment.
So you're saying her stay in India would be an irritant, but it wouldn't be a deal breaker, strategic deal breaker. So.
No, that's unlikely, highly unlikely. I think the deal breaker issues are, again, as I articulate in the book, if there is a mass exodus of minorities from Bangladesh due to systemic targeting, if Bangladesh decides to host anti-India sort of militants, whether it's who are targeting anywhere in northeast of India or elsewhere, or it really kind of opens up its military bases, or some sort of strategic ingress, sensitive strategic ingress to the Chinese or the Pakistanis towards it. I think those are issues which are much, much more sensitive than the fate of Sheikh Hasina. And on all those issues, at least, for all the rhetoric that is flying around, I suspect Dhaka would be careful.
I was also delighted while reading this book. Well, maybe not delighted, but it was a good reminder that when the CAA NRC was rolled out around 2019, that Sheikh Hasina and her government took umbrage with it. I mean, they did express dissatisfaction with it. Since you've interviewed countless intelligence officials and you've interacted with people senior up in that domain, was it that our intelligence officials did not preempt some backlash from our close neighbors like Bangladesh, or was it that there weren't contingencies put in place once CAA was rolled out?
See, arguably, Sheikh Hasina's, then Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's response to the CAA, whatever statement she made, and she made very guarded statements from what I remember, was actually pretty muted. If anything, at a strategic level, for all the, perhaps some media reports here and there, at a strategic level, India was actually pretty content with Sheikh Hasina not making CAA a kind of serious issue between the two countries, as many had feared. Pia. She made some statements, and I think she needed to make those statements for her domestic credibility more than kind of poking India in the eye in a diplomatic sense. And I think that was fairly well understood. In fact, if let's assume India were to introduce an amendment of that quality today, I suspect the reaction from Dhaka would be much stronger, much more, much more visible, much more heard, which was not the case when in 2019, 2020. I mean, the pandemic took its own course, and that kind of, muted a lot of these conversations for a brief while, at least in Bangladesh it did. But no, I think the fact that those amendments had been made, that act had been introduced, did create considerable degree of it was not seen as a positive sign by a wide body of public opinion in Bangladesh, but that did not translate into any diplomatic spat, as people think it did between Dhaka. I would argue that perhaps Afghans were much more vocal about that. I remember former President Karzai at least making a strong statement about that, stronger statement than Sheikh Hasina, than the Bangladeshis were.
Well, I think when we might be running out of time, I would like to follow up on that, but we should also speak a little bit about connectivity, which you have covered extensively in your book. And in fact, you say that the Modi government's method of countering Chinese capital in its Near East has been quote unquote favoritism of Adani. My question is, given the geopolitical churn in Myanmar, Bangladesh, and India's investments in certain projects there, whether it's port infrastructure or otherwise, when it comes to Adani, which also has investments in, let's say, the Haifa port in Israel, is it strategically sound or sustainable for the government to put all its eggs in one company with regard to these connectivity projects?
So Adani might be the biggest player, but in Bangladesh, it's also the Ambanis. Reliance Industries also have very considerable equities. So we must not lose sight. Tata had considerable equities. I mean, even before they were supposed to have a bigger footprint, which did not work out. Partly any rising power PR will have certain degree of favoritism in their domestic kind of corporate space. And it's not surprising that the BJP has favored Adani or Ambani or the list of kind of 10, 15 business groups which they are working with very closely. The concern has been the terms of their operations on the ground, right? How does the Adani Group go about actually building infrastructure, delivering services and goods like electricity and power in countries like Bangladesh or the Yangon port? They had to kind of divest from that after the coup because of the situation and the sanctions that had come into force. But how do you go about, let's say, supplying electricity through the Godapa plant in Jharkhand to northeast of Bengal? The terms of that deal are the source of the problem for people in Bangladesh and the interim government as well. It's not that Adani Group is supplying it. I think that is not really the problem point. It could have been some other group. But if you have to pay something between 400 to 500 million as capacity charge per month without even getting one single kind of megawatt of electricity, that's a huge amount for a country like Bangladesh, which is teetering on the edge of, default in some senses. So those issues, I think, became much more, and they still are playing out right now as we speak, were much more salient than just the Adani Group as such. Now, yes, a separate conversation can be had that, there's a very strong marriage between politics and business in India, perhaps too strong, too tight a relationship for the democratic or strategic health of the country. But I do not think that the recipient countries in the neighborhood really mind that. That is not something they have a problem with.
Well, Avinash Paliwal, thank you so much for taking the time out to speak to ThePrint, especially about this intriguing book that I heartily recommend to our viewers. We'll be tracking the events in Bangladesh, of course, and Myanmar and India's Near East, as I'm sure you will as well. Thank you once again for joining the program.
Thank you for having me here, too.